Welcome to a new video series that we're going to start. And if you logged on to this video, you know that the subject is how can I become effective and productive as a Christian? Interestingly enough, I spent 34 plus years working for a Fortune 500 chemical company, and it's scary to how much money they spent every year with a bevy of engineers and industrial engineers giving us insight into how our processes could become more productive and the efficiencies. And they were constantly coming in and rewriting job descriptions and analyzing workers' performance and really weeding out jobs that didn't need to be done or jobs that were redundant. And it was a constant evaluation of productivity and efficiency. And interesting enough, uh, when they would come in to do these job evaluations, all of us had our own opinions as to what would make them most efficient and productive. But sometimes we were almost insulted for them to suggest that there might be a better way to do things. Um, in this series, we're going to be spending a lot of time in primarily in Second Peter, but we'll give a little bit of background on the letters that Peter wrote in the process of doing that. And when you think about being productive as a Christian, um, we have to really look at it as God has given us a direction and a mission, a job, if you will, to carry out his plan as Jesus laid it out to his disciples, mainly through John 12 through 17 primarily. But so he gave us the ministry of reconciliation, and so that's our role. We're also ambassadors, and so when we want to look at those responsibilities that we have, we certainly would want to be efficient and productive in everything that we do as we go forward. And so we're going to be spending quite a bit of time in doing that. And one of the things that's a little bit different, I suppose, about being a Christian versus working in the industry, um, we were constantly having to justify our work, our accomplishments, and look back, like even on an annual basis on how much we had produced, or how much productivity we had. And while as a Christian we aren't really measured by a finite number or anything like that, but in a maybe a subjective way, each of us probably evaluates even ourselves as to how we're doing in accomplishing the task that Jesus sent us out to do. Um, and we even when we were tasked with certain jobs in the workforce, there was this thing called the development plan, which really meant, and that's a dreaded type situation, which really meant that when you came onto it, you were in your job and maybe hadn't had the best year you ever had, and maybe there are reasons for it. And so those of us who were supervisors, we had to come up with a development plan for someone who wasn't performing necessarily at the standard that we would expect, and we had to develop that plan so that when that person saw the things that they needed to change or the goals that they needed to accomplish, they were spelled out, and they could measure how well they're doing based on those goals and accomplishments. And to a certain extent, what we're going to be learning is that there are certain parameters that God kind of lays out through Peter that would help us to get a measure or a feel or sense of how we're doing in accomplishing God's purpose for our life. And certainly, God's purpose for our life wasn't just for us to be born and we live for a long, good old life and then we die. We have a greater responsibility and a greater role in the creation than just that, and so that's what we really want to look at mostly in this. This is really just going to be sort of an introductory. We're going to dig into it much deeper later on, but the letters that Peter wrote, First Peter and Second Peter, those letters were written somewhere in the neighborhood of 64 AD, plus or minus, a couple of years, which would have made it to basically about 30 years after the day of Pentecost and when the church started. And so we have this time span that took place, and certainly we know in that 8-year period when they were all in Jerusalem, the church grew, rapidly. I mean, in great numbers, even on the first day, 3,000 people, and then a little later, another 5,000. And so when you think about that particular um, growth in the church, productivity was it was obvious. The results were obvious on what was going on and how that was taking place. But during the time when Peter wrote this, you will notice as we read in some of the scriptures, and we'll get some of this from First Peter and from Second Peter, is the church was going under a great deal of persecution, and of course these letters are written to the churches in Asia Minor, and the church was going through a great deal of persecution, not necessarily for the message they were teaching, but it's believed that this persecution was coming from Nero, who, at that time, Rome, there was a tremendous fire in Rome, and Nero blamed the Christians for it. So, although there was no indication that they had anything to do with it, but it was the Christians became a scapegoat, for all the tragedy that was going on in the city of Rome, and so that persecution wasn't just necessarily limited just to Rome, but it was something that was carried out pretty much province wide, and that would included those in Asia Minor. And so the persecution was not coming from necessarily primarily from the Jewish element of believers, um, or atheists or anything else. It was primarily coming from Nero, and so that persecution was quite severe. And other historical books, record a lot of that. We don't have any idea how many Christians were involved in the various churches that Peter mentions in First Peter. Um, he says here when he addresses that first letter, he says, "To God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia." Um, and so we have no idea how many Christians were involved in the church at that particular time. It'd be pure speculation on that, but it was obviously significant enough that Peter would write letters to them, and the persecution was quite significant. Um, and certainly, those of us who are living in the environment that we're living in, we're not we're not getting persecution coming from a Muslim group. We don't live in a Muslim community or country. We're primarily Christian community, and so we don't suffer the degree of persecution uh, that others might suffer from a Muslim or other religious backgrounds. But we certainly do. Our religion and our belief systems are under a considerable amount of attack. Our moral values and other things, we read about it all the time. We hear about it all the time. So there is a certain element of persecution, but not physical death and the torture and all the things that they endured. Ours is more, to a large extent, is emotional and psychological. Um, and so we will look at what was going on there, and we'll look at Peter's focus on that, what he focused on in writing the letters about these things, and we'll focus on that, and then we will focus on the things that he encouraged the Christians to focus on as they continued their spiritual walk. And I'm just going to pick a certain passage out of Second Peter just to give you a feel for what we're going to be looking at. Um, I'm going to reread in Second Peter 1, beginning with verse 3. It says, "His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. Through these, He has given us His very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption of the world caused by evil desires. For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. For if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from being ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. But whoever does not have them is nearsighted and blind, forgetting that they have been cleansed from their past sins. So if we look at that particular thing, obviously the beginning with verse 5, it lays out the elements that we would need to be uh, effective and productive, as a disciple of Jesus in the present time. Um, Goodness, in the first two verses, we could spend many videos, discussion periods talking about just those first two verses. And we will spend a little bit of time talking about that because it kind of lays the groundwork in why we would want to make every effort, as it talks about here, to add these qualities to our faith. And so this will be an interesting study, I think. I have no idea how many videos we're going to do. We'll try not to string them out too long, but it should be a very interesting study. And if you know anyone who might be interested down the road, let them know and just tell them where we are, and we'll get this going. Since this is just more of an introductory type thing and tell you what's going to happen, you can expect another video shortly to begin the series, and we'll kind of go from there. Thanks for joining in, and we will see you in the next video.